inherited only her father's old barn, rotted, overgrown, and forgotten. Her relatives joked that all she got were dust and rats, but when she started cleaning it and moved the hay that hadn't been touched for decades, she discovered something that changed her life forever and left everyone speechless. Subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching this video from. The day had stretched itself thin over the parched land, a sky too bright for morning, too heavy for comfort. When Miriam Harper stepped out of the small clapboard church, the air felt thick with the scent of dust and lilies, of grief that had already started to fade for everyone but her. The townsfolk nodded to her as they passed, polite, distant, as though she were a shadow passing through the memory of her own home. They whispered about her return, about how long she'd been gone, and how strange it was that she came back only to bury the man who'd once been the spine of the county's farms. Her father, Harold Harper, had been many things to many people. A stubborn old man, a respected farmer, a widower who never remarried. To her, he had been everything, and then, near the end, something fragile and fading, someone she had fought to keep in the world a little longer. The churchyard emptied slowly, leaving behind the muted hum of insects and the rattle of car doors. Her brothers had already moved ahead, their suits looking foreign on men who'd never stayed clean for more than an hour on the farm. Tom, the eldest, had taken the lead as always, directing, shaking hands, speaking to the lawyer with a practiced voice. Daniel followed, restless, tapping his phone, smiling when he shouldn't have. Miriam lingered. The grave lay covered with fresh soil, the wooden cross standing at its head like an apology. She wanted to say something, a final word that might bridge the years between the little girl who followed her father through the fields and the woman who held his hand as he forgot her name. But nothing came. Only the wind, warm and dry, carried through the grass, brushing her skirt as if to move her forward. When she finally reached the old Harper house and its porch sagging under the weight of years, she could hear laughter spilling from the kitchen. Her brothers were there, the sound of ice clinking in glasses, the smell of whiskey sharp in the air. The lawyer, a thin man with round spectacles, sat at the table with a folder in front of him. His tone was soft but efficient. He had done this many times. Miriam stood by the doorway, hands clasped, as the division of their father's life was spoken aloud in neat, rehearsed sentences. The farmhouse, with its acres of land and working equipment, went to Tom. The savings account and the small motorboat were left to Daniel. And then came her name. Miriam Harper, recipient of the barn. Just the barn. The words hung in the air like a cough no one wanted to acknowledge. Tom's mouth twisted into a half-smile. Daniel snorted, muttering something about poetic justice. The lawyer cleared his throat, sensing the discomfort but unwilling to linger. Papers were signed, hands shook, and just like that, decades of soil and sweat and sacrifice were parceled out, labeled, and finished. Miriam said nothing. She felt the edges of the table under her fingertips, rough wood that her father had built when she was a child. She remembered standing on it to reach a jar of honey, her father laughing, telling her to be careful. Now her brothers were the ones laughing, and she was the one standing alone. As they drank to themselves, Tom leaned back in his chair, his voice smooth with arrogance. "Guess that old place is all yours, sis. You always did like digging through dirt." Daniel chuckled, raising his glass in mock salute. "Hey, maybe you'll find a fortune under all that hay." The joke landed easily, laughter breaking against her silence. They didn't mean to be cruel, not exactly. They simply didn't think she mattered enough to hurt. For them, she had become a background detail in their father's story, the daughter who stayed behind when life called everyone else forward. Miria's eyes drifted toward the window, where, beyond the fields, the outline of the barn slumped against the horizon. Even in the dimming light, it looked tired, the red paint long stripped away by rain and time, the roof caved in one corner like a wounded shoulder. Yet, something about it drew her gaze. It had been the center of her world once, before her mother died, before her father's silence grew thick around the house. That was where she learned to fix a broken plow, to stack hay, to patch a fence. It was where she'd heard her father's whistle echo off the rafters, low and steady, while the horses stamped and the smell of fresh grain filled the air. Then, one day, without explanation, he'd locked the door and told everyone to stay out. Her brothers didn't remember that part. They didn't remember the day he nailed the door shut, or the look in his eyes when she'd asked why. He'd just said, "Some things stay closed for a reason," and turned away. After that, no one spoke of the barn again. When the meeting was over, Tom clapped her shoulder as if to say it was done. "Don't take it too hard," he said lightly. "You know how sentimental Dad was. Maybe he thought you'd make something of it." Daniel grinned. "Yeah, or maybe he knew no one else would want it." More laughter, more clinking glasses. Miria stepped out before the noise could swallow her. Outside, the late afternoon light burned gold across the fields. The wind tugged gently at her dress as she walked down the gravel path toward the edge of the property. The land was quiet now, stripped of animals, the fences broken, the soil dry. Every step she took crunched beneath her boots, the sound both familiar and foreign. She had been gone for 12 years, long enough for everything to shift slightly out of place, yet not enough for it to stop feeling like home. When she reached the barn, she stopped. The doors hung unevenly, one half open as if caught mid-thought. A swallow darted through the gap, disappearing into the shadow beyond. She hesitated before stepping closer, her hand brushing the rough grain of the wood. The scent of dust and hay rose around her, the same smell that used to cling to her father's clothes. She closed her eyes, letting memory and present blur until she could almost hear him again, his voice steady, his laugh warm, his boots echoing against the floorboards. But the sound that came was only the sigh of the wind through the broken boards. She stood there until the sun dipped low, painting everything in bronze. Then, turning back toward the house, she saw the porch lights flicker on and her brothers still inside, their laughter drifting faintly across the field. It struck her how easily they could celebrate when everything that mattered had been hollowed out. She'd thought she had made peace with them, with all of it, but now something heavy and bright settled in her chest, a quiet defiance that pulsed like a heartbeat. That night, the house creaked around her like an old ship. In her childhood bedroom, the wallpaper still peeled at the corners, and the ceiling fan spun with a slow, uneven rhythm. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled voices of her brothers downstairs. Every laugh, every clatter of ice and glass was a reminder of how little she fit into their world, but the barn lingered behind her eyelids, its shadow, its silence, its strange pull. Her mind wandered back to the last months of her father's life. How fragile he had become, his once powerful hands trembling as she fed him spoonfuls of soup. How sometimes in the half-light of dawn he'd mumble about keeping it safe, though he never said what it was. Once, in a rare moment of clarity, he'd looked at her with eyes full of something unspoken and said, "You'll know what to do when the time comes." She thought he meant the end. Now she wasn't so sure. Near midnight, Miria rose from the bed and went to the window. The moon lay low over the fields, pale and swollen. The barn stood in the distance, its roof gleaming faintly like old silver. She pressed her palm to the glass, feeling the coolness of it seep into her skin. The world was asleep, but she couldn't rest. There was something unfinished between her and that place, something waiting to be found or forgiven. In the morning, she would go back. She would open the doors again and see what years of silence had hidden. She didn't know what she expected to find. Dust, tools, maybe a memory too heavy to bear. But the thought of walking away from it felt impossible. The barn was hers now. Not the house, not the money, not the polished future her brothers had carved out for themselves, but this wounded piece of earth and timber that once echoed with her father's voice. As dawn began to rise, Miria finally lay back, her heart slow but restless. The first birds began to call outside, faint and uncertain. She closed her eyes and saw, behind them all, the shape of the barn door, shut tight, waiting. Somewhere inside, under years of dust and darkness, her father's secret was breathing still. She didn't know yet that by opening it, she would uncover not only what he had hidden, but the reason he had chosen her, and only her, to inherit what everyone else thought was nothing. By the time the sun climbed over the horizon, Miria was already dressed, her hair tied back, boots laced. She stepped outside into the chill of early light, feeling the dampness cling to her skin. The gravel crunched beneath her steps, leading her toward the shape that had haunted her through the night. Behind her, the house was still, her brothers asleep in their separate rooms. Ahead, the barn waited in silence, its door slightly ajar, as if it had been expecting her all along. Morning came pale and silent, the kind that blurred the edges of everything in soft gray light. Miria stood at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, watching the mist lift slowly from the fields. The house was quiet now. Her brothers had driven back into town after breakfast, leaving behind the faint smell of cigarettes and fried eggs and the clatter of unwashed dishes. She didn't mind their absence. The air felt easier to breathe without their laughter filling it. From where she stood, she could see the barn at the far end of the property, its silhouette leaning against the light like an exhausted soldier. It was strange how it seemed smaller now, and yet, as she stared, it filled her with the same restless pull she'd felt as a child. The road leading there was overgrown with weeds. Dew clung to the grass, soaking through the cuffs of her jeans as she walked. The sound of her boots crunching against the gravel was the only rhythm in the wide silence. Around her, the land lay open and familiar, and yet it felt like walking into a memory that had been left untouched for too long. She could almost hear her father's whistle carried by the wind, that low, steady tune he used to hum when fixing fences or brushing down the horses. She remembered how she used to follow him everywhere, a small shadow trying to keep up with his long strides. He would glance back, grin, and call her my right hand. Back then, the barn had been the heart of everything. The smell of hay and oil, the flicker of lantern light, the warmth of life moving through it. Now, as she reached the doors, it was nothing but rot and ruin. The hinges groaned when she pushed them open, dust tumbling in slow spirals through the beam of early sunlight. The smell was thick and stale. Wood, rust, old straw, the faint tang of something animal that had long since gone. She paused at the threshold, her hand resting on the splintered frame, and felt that strange, unnameable mixture of grief and belonging rise in her chest. It was here, always here, where her world had once made sense. Inside, the light fell in thin stripes through cracks in the boards, catching on the motes of dust that drifted in the air like tiny, weightless ghosts. The ground was layered with debris, broken boards, rusted tools, pieces of rope stiff with age. Cobwebs hung like curtains from the rafters. She stood in the center of the floor for a long time, letting her eyes adjust, her breath echoing faintly against the emptiness. Every sound was amplified, the creak of a loose plank beneath her boots, the distant hum of insects outside, the faint thud of her heartbeat. She started with the corners, the way she always did when cleaning something that mattered. There was no real reason to. No one would see this place, no one cared, but her body remembered the rhythm. Sweep, gather, clear. She found an old broom propped against the wall, its bristles curled and brittle, but it would do. Slowly, she began to work, sweeping years of dust into uneven piles. The air filled with the sharp scent of old wood and grit. It clung to her hair and skin, settled in her throat, but she kept going. As she cleaned, she unearthed traces of her father scattered everywhere. His hammer still hanging from a nail by the workbench, a pair of cracked leather gloves, a rusted horseshoe nailed to a beam for luck. On a shelf, she found a small tin box of nails, the same kind he used to pour into her palms when she was a child, trusting her to hold them steady while he fixed the fence posts. It struck her then, how his hands had always seemed larger than life, and how small hers had been next to them. Now both were gone from this place, one buried under earth, the other holding a broom like a relic. Hours passed without her noticing. The light shifted from gray to gold, then dimmed again. Sweat beaded along her neck, streaking the dust that clung to her skin. She stopped only when the air itself seemed to thicken, when every breath came with the taste of wood and age. She leaned against a beam, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand, and looked around. It wasn't much cleaner, not really, but it was beginning to feel less like a tomb. She could see the floor now, uneven planks warped from years of damp. She could almost imagine it the way it used to be, alive with noise, her father's boots thudding, the animals shifting in their stalls. And then she noticed it. In the far corner, behind the old feed bins, the hay lay in a mound that didn't look natural. The rest of the barn floor had long since been trampled flat or cleared away, but here it rose in a compact heap, like someone had stacked it deliberately and left it untouched for years. She frowned, curiosity stirring despite her exhaustion. Setting the broom aside, she crossed the room, her boots crunching over the debris. When she pressed her hand against the pile, it didn't give easily. The hay was damp in the center, heavy and dense, packed down tight. She grabbed a handful and pulled it away. Beneath it, the air felt cooler, the smell more metallic. Something was off. She crouched down, digging deeper, shaking the clumps loose until the straw scattered in pale arcs around her. Beneath the last layer, her knuckles brushed against something hard. She froze, then pushed away the remaining hay. There, embedded in the floorboards, was a metal ring, rusted but solid, bolted into a square outline in the wood. A trap door. Miria sat back on her heels, her breath catching. The boards around it were old, but sturdier than the rest, and though the ring was coated with rust, it looked purposeful. Her pulse quickened as she ran her hand along the edges, tracing where the outline met the floor. It was sealed tight. She tugged at the ring once, twice, it didn't budge. Whatever was beneath had stayed hidden for a long time. She stayed there, staring at it, the silence pressing close around her. She could hear the soft tick of cooling metal from the tools on the bench, The distant rustle of the fields outside, the faint buzz of a fly trapped somewhere in the rafters. The air seemed heavier here, charged with something that wasn't quite fear, but expectation. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "You'll know what to do when the time comes." Maybe this was what he meant, but even as the thought flickered, she felt herself hesitate. The light was fading, the shadows growing deeper. It was foolish to stay here alone in the dark. Whatever was under that floor had waited this long. It could wait one more night. She rose slowly, brushing the dust from her jeans, though her hands kept trembling. As she reached the door, she looked back once more at the pile she'd uncovered. The ring caught the last slant of sunlight, glinting faintly beneath the dust. It looked almost like an eye staring back at her. That night, she couldn't sleep. The house felt too quiet, too full of memories. The ceiling fan spun its slow circles, whispering over and over the same sound until it became the rhythm of her thoughts. Her brothers hadn't returned. Their cars were gone, their voices silenced, leaving her alone with the weight of the place. She tried to close her eyes, but every time she did, she saw that glint of metal, that shape hidden beneath years of straw and neglect. She thought of her father again, not the sick man she had cared for in the final months, thin and frail, but the man he had been before that. Steady, secretive, proud. He'd had a way of looking at her when he wanted her to understand something without saying it aloud. A look that had once frustrated her but now felt like a riddle she was only beginning to solve. He had locked the barn when she turned 16, nailed the door shut, and never told her why. When she'd asked, he'd simply said, "Some things aren't ready to be seen yet." She'd thought he meant the pain after her mother's death. But what if it had been something else entirely? By midnight, she was sitting up in bed, staring at the pale wash of moonlight across the floor. Her thoughts spun in endless circles. What could he have hidden there? It wasn't like him to keep secrets, at least not ones this tangible. He had never trusted banks or strangers. He'd buried cash once under the porch years ago, but this felt different. The way the hay had been arranged, the way the boards felt, this wasn't just storage. This was protection. She got up and went to the window. The barn was visible even in the moonlight, a darker shape against the silvered fields. Somewhere deep inside her, she felt a pulse of both dread and curiosity, intertwined so tightly that she couldn't separate them. Her fingers gripped the windowsill until her knuckles whitened. Tomorrow, she told herself, she would open it tomorrow. And yet, the thought didn't bring rest. The hours stretched thin, her heartbeat steady and insistent, until finally the first pale light of dawn began to seep through the curtains. She dressed quietly, pulled on her boots, and went outside. The morning air was crisp and wet with dew, the smell of grass sharp in her nose. Her breath rose in small clouds as she walked down the path. The world was still, as if holding its breath with her. When she reached the barn, she stopped in front of the door and laid her hand against it. The wood felt cool beneath her palm, alive in its own way, humming faintly with the passage of time. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The same scent, the same hush. But now, the corner that had haunted her all night seemed to call her forward. She walked to it without hesitation, the sound of her boots muffled by the straw. The ring was still there, dull in the morning light. She knelt beside it, tracing the outline once more. The rust crumbled under her fingertips. It was real. It was waiting. Her father had built this floor, these beams, every inch of this structure with his own hands. He had chosen what to hide beneath it. The thought sent a tremor through her chest, not of fear, but something like reverence. She stood, dusted herself off, and exhaled slowly. Not today, not yet. She would need light and tools and the strength to face whatever waited below. For now, it was enough to know that it was there, that the past she thought she'd buried with her father was breathing just beneath her feet. As she stepped out into the pale morning sun, she looked back once more. The barn loomed behind her, half ruined and patient, as if it had been waiting all these years for her to return and listen. And she, without meaning to, whispered into the wind, "I'll come back." The fields answered with a rustle like a sigh, and somewhere, high in the rafters, a bird took flight, its wings scattering the dust that had lain undisturbed for decades. The morning air was sharper than the one before, filled with the scent of damp earth and the faint sweetness of grass beginning to dry under a pale sun. Miria stood once again before the barn, her breath visible in the cool light. The door creaked open easily now, as though it recognized her. Dust drifted in the thin golden rays that spilled through the broken boards, painting the air with slow, shimmering motion. She had come prepared this time. A heavy flashlight hung from her wrist, a crowbar in her hand, and a pair of gloves already streaked with dirt. She wasn't sure why her heart was pounding so hard. Maybe because today she would no longer wonder what her father had hidden. She would finally know. Inside, the air felt colder, stiller than it had the day before. The silence pressed against her ears until she could hear her own breathing. The heap of hay she'd cleared now lay scattered in rough piles across the floor, exposing the trapdoor beneath. The metal ring caught the light again, dull but certain. For a moment, she hesitated. Part of her wanted to believe there was nothing there, that her curiosity would lead only to dust and disappointment, and she could close the door and pretend none of it mattered. But that was impossible now. It had already begun. She knelt down and brushed away the remaining straw, fingers tracing the lines of the wooden square. The edges were smooth from years of wear, but the corners still held firm. She slid the crowbar beneath the seam and pressed down. The wood groaned, reluctant, then gave a shuddering pop. Dust billowed up, thick and choking, as the trapdoor lifted slightly off the floor. Miria coughed into her sleeve, eyes watering, but didn't stop. She hooked her fingers through the ring and pulled. The door rose with a long, aching creak, the hinges shrieking like something waking from a century of sleep. Beneath it lay a hollow darkness, deeper than she expected. The smell that rose from it was old, earthy, metallic, damp, like the scent of a cellar sealed off from air and light. Her flashlight beam cut through the shadows, revealing a narrow wooden staircase that disappeared into blackness. The steps looked rough but solid, handmade from the same kind of timber her father had always used for his repairs. She stood at the edge of the opening, the air cool against her face. For a long moment, she did not move. She remembered her father's hands, the way they'd held hers when she was small, guiding her fingers along a fence post, teaching her to measure twice before cutting, to build things that would last. He had built this too. Every board, every nail. Whatever waited below had been crafted by him, in secrecy and purpose. Miria took a slow breath and began to descend. The first step groaned beneath her weight, but held firm. Then the next. Each creak echoed like a heartbeat, pulsing into the heavy quiet. The beam of her flashlight trembled slightly as she moved. The walls were close on either side, covered in a thin sheen of moisture, and the smell of damp soil filled her lungs. Halfway down, the light flickered across something carved into one of the boards, a mark, faint and deliberate. 2 overlapping circles like a pair of linked chains. She brushed her fingers over it, feeling the groove of the knife that had cut it, then kept going. At the bottom, her boot sank slightly into hard-packed dirt. The ceiling was low, forcing her to stoop. The space opened wider than she'd expected, about the size of a small room. The floor was uneven, the walls a mix of concrete, timber, and rusted metal sheets nailed into place. Everything smelled of age. She swept her flashlight slowly across the room. There was an old recliner in one corner, its cushions split open, stuffing spilling out like pale guts. Nearby, a metal filing cabinet leaned crookedly against the wall, drawers half open and rusted solid. A broken lantern sat beside it. Shelves ran along the far side of the room, sagging under the weight of boxes, jars, and stacks of what looked like yellowed papers. Her light caught on an unplugged refrigerator, sealed shut with duct tape that had turned brittle and gray. Spiderwebs connected everything. The shelves, the ceiling, the forgotten relics of a life lived in secret. Miria took a few careful steps forward, her boots crunching on what sounded like fragments of glass. She aimed the light down. Bottles. Dozens of them shattered across the floor, their labels eaten away by time. The faint scent of vinegar or wine hung in the air, too faint to place. She swallowed, forcing herself to move slowly, scanning each shadowed corner. It was colder down here, the kind of cold that seemed to come from beneath the skin. She rubbed her arms, even as her curiosity drove her onward. This didn't feel like a storm shelter or a storage room. It felt intentional. The way things were arranged, the way the space seemed built not for comfort, but for protection. Someone had lived here, or hidden something here, long enough to make it part of the earth itself. Her flashlight swept over a stack of cardboard boxes. She knelt, brushing away the dust, and pulled one open. Inside were newspapers, their ink faded but still legible in places. The top headline caught her eye: Freedom March turns violent in Mississippi. Another: Local families lose land amid rising tensions. Each date was from decades ago. She lifted one, feeling the thinness of the paper, the way it crumbled slightly under her touch. Beneath it were more. Dozens of clippings, some marked with her father's handwriting. She froze. He had been keeping records. She set the papers aside carefully and opened the next box. This one held photographs, black and white images of people she didn't know. Men, women, children, standing in front of farmhouses, trucks, even fields like theirs. Some smiling, some unsmiling, most looking straight at the camera as though staring right at her. None of them had names written on the back. For a long while she simply sat there, her flashlight resting against the ground, its beam angling upward into the dark. The light glinted off the metal edges of the filing cabinet and shimmered faintly across the refrigerator's dull surface. The silence deepened until she could hear her own pulse again, steady, echoing. What had her father been doing here? Collecting memories? Evidence? Secrets? She rose and walked to the old recliner. The fabric was stiff with dust, but when she brushed it with her glove, a faint outline showed, a headrest worn smooth where someone had sat often. Next to it, a rusted tin ashtray still held the gray crumble of ashes. She could almost see him here, her father, sitting in that chair, sorting through his papers under the dim light of a lantern, his face lined but calm. He had spent time here, perhaps years. She turned toward the filing cabinet. Its drawers resisted at first, groaning when she pulled. The top one gave way suddenly, spilling a cascade of papers and folders onto the floor. Miria crouched and gathered them, coughing as the dust swirled up. The documents were varied: old deeds, crop records, some names she recognized from neighboring farms decades back. But then, buried in the middle, she found something stranger. Photocopied letters from federal offices, appeals for lost property, denied claims, stamps that read "rejected" in red ink. Beneath them, a smaller envelope with no markings at all. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a photograph of her father, much younger, standing beside two men in worn clothes, all three looking serious. Behind them was the outline of this same barn. The back of the photo bore only a single line written in his careful hand: Harper and the Brothers, 1964. Miria's breath caught. She didn't know who the brothers were. She had never heard of them. But the year, that was when he would have been barely 30, just after her mother's first pregnancy. What had he been involved in then? She sank down onto the dirt floor, the photo in her lap, and felt a strange mix of awe and confusion. Every discovery seemed to pull her deeper, unraveling a thread she hadn't known existed. And yet, the deeper she went, the more she felt that her father wasn't hiding something shameful. He was protecting something sacred. She shone her flashlight once more around the room. It landed on a cluster of black plastic bags stacked neatly in the far corner, as though waiting for someone to return. She hadn't noticed them before. They were clean, newer than everything else down here. That realization unsettled her. Her father had been gone for months before she returned home. Had someone else come down here since? The thought chilled her. She moved closer, her boots stirring the dust into small clouds. The bags were sealed with thick tape, the kind her father used for patching tool handles or wrapping boxes for long storage. There were 7 or 8 of them, all identical. She touched one. It was heavy, filled with something solid. Her heart beat faster. Not tonight, she told herself, not yet. She'd found enough for one day. The weight of it, of secrets, of the silence pressing in around her, was enough to make her hands tremble. She would come back tomorrow with more light, maybe with the crowbar again. Whatever was inside could wait another sunrise. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking beneath her. When she reached the top, she pushed the trapdoor closed with a dull thud, sealing the darkness below once more. The barn above felt almost bright in comparison, the sunlight warm and soft on her face. She breathed deeply, letting the air fill her lungs, and only then realized how stale the air below had been. Outside, the fields stretched in calm indifference. The wind stirred the tall grass, and the world seemed unchanged. Yet everything had shifted. The father she thought she knew, the quiet man who fixed fences and read the newspaper every morning, had lived another life beneath their feet. A life hidden even from his children. By the time she reached the house, the sun was already sinking behind the trees. She sat on the porch steps, her gloves still dusty, her clothes streaked with dirt, and stared out toward the barn in the fading light. There was a new weight in her chest, not sorrow, not quite fear, but something else entirely. Expectation, maybe. The sense that the story she'd been told all her life was missing its most important chapter, and she had just brushed her fingers against its first page. When night came, she couldn't bring herself to eat. The house was too quiet again, the rooms echoing with old creaks. She lay in bed and watched the ceiling fan spin in slow, uneven circles. The images replayed in her mind: the stairs, the marks on the walls, the faded faces in the photographs, and beneath it all, that neat row of sealed black bags. She turned onto her side, pulling the quilt to her chin. Tomorrow, she promised herself again. Tomorrow she would open them. Tomorrow she would understand why her father had built that place, why he had kept it secret, and why, of all things, he had left it to her. But even as she tried to close her eyes, she knew sleep would not come. The barn was calling to her now, its silence louder than any voice, and somewhere deep beneath it, the past waited, breathing, patient, certain that she would return. The next morning arrived gray and heavy, a dull sky pressing low against the horizon. The house seemed to resist waking. Every creak of the floorboards echoed like a reminder that time moved slower here. Miria had barely slept. The memory of what she had found below the barn clung to her mind as stubbornly as the dust that had settled into her hair and clothes. When she rose and washed her face, she felt as though the night had not ended at all, only stretched thin into another day of questions. She poured herself a cup of coffee, but didn't drink it. The smell of it filled the kitchen, bitter and grounding, yet her thoughts were elsewhere, circling that dark space beneath the barn. She could still see it when she closed her eyes. The shelves lined with boxes, the yellowed papers, the bags stacked neatly in the corner. Her father's handwriting had been unmistakable on those old documents. It was as familiar to her as her own. Firm, deliberate, the way he used to label the jars in the pantry or the wooden crates in the shed. It wasn't possible that those papers were meaningless. Everything down there had been arranged too carefully, the order too precise. He had meant for someone to find it. By the time she stepped outside, the wind had picked up. Clouds moved fast overhead, and the air carried the faint promise of rain. She crossed the field slowly, her boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. The barn stood waiting as it had before, unchanged but not indifferent. It felt almost alive now, watching her come closer. Inside, the smell greeted her again, a mix of hay, rust, and age. The trapdoor waited in the corner like an invitation. She didn't hesitate this time. Kneeling, she lifted it open and aimed her flashlight down into the dark. The beam fell across the stairs, the same narrow steps that had seemed endless the day before. They looked steeper now, as though the night had deepened their depth. She descended carefully, her boots echoing on the wood. The air grew colder with each step. When she reached the bottom, she turned slowly, letting the light sweep across the walls. The room looked the same. Quiet, patient, but the sense of mystery had thickened. The black plastic bags still sat in their corner, their surfaces faintly glistening under the beam. She avoided them for the moment and went instead to the boxes she had opened before. She knelt beside them, pulling out more papers. The newspaper clippings were older than she had thought at first, some from the late 50s, others from the early 70s. Headlines blurred together: marches, protests, missing persons, families losing land. In the margins of many articles, her father had underlined words in pencil: displacement, freedom, violence, ownership. The pattern wasn't random. It was as if he'd been tracking something, following a story that never reached its ending. Beneath the papers, she found folders of letters, official-looking documents with faded stamps. Many bore government seals, others the letterheads of law offices or churches. They were written by hand, some typewritten, and every one of them spoke of loss. Families appealing for land that had been taken from them, requests for legal help that went unanswered. Names she didn't recognize repeated themselves: Johnson, Cole, Rivers, alongside dates and addresses scrawled in the margins. Miria set the papers aside and sat back on her heels. Her father had kept all of this hidden, carefully preserved. Why? She pictured him down here, sorting through letters and records, copying documents by lamplight. It wasn't idle curiosity. He had been doing something deliberate. He was protecting something or someone. On the lowest shelf, she found a small metal box. It was the kind he used to keep nails in when she was a child, dented and rusted at the edges. She opened it and found a handful of photographs folded neatly inside. The first showed a group of men and women standing beside a truck, their faces proud, their clothes simple but clean. They were outside, perhaps on land like theirs. In the background, Miria could see faintly a line of trees and something that looked like a fence made from rough boards. On the back of the photo, written in her father's careful handwriting, were the words, "Safe Passage, 1963. Her breath caught. Safe Passage. The phrase stirred something deep in her, a memory of her father's stories, half whispered when she was small. He had sometimes spoken of people who traveled at night, of those who moved quietly between towns when it wasn't safe to stay. She had thought he meant neighbors avoiding storms or debts, but this was something else. She looked through the rest of the photographs. Each one was like a fragment of another world. People standing in front of barns, wagons, and houses. Children smiling beside tired horses. A man with a bandaged arm shaking her father's hand. There were no explanations, just moments frozen in time. Miria felt her chest tighten. Her father had been part of something larger than their farm, something she had never understood. He hadn't simply been a farmer living in isolation. He had been connected to lives far beyond their fence line. As she laid the photos down, her flashlight beam swept across the corner of the room, catching on something she hadn't seen before. A small wooden crate, half buried under a pile of discarded tools. She dragged it into the open and brushed off the dust. It was nailed shut, but light enough to lift. On its side, faint letters had been burned into the wood. H.H. Supplies. Her father's initials. She pried it open with the edge of the crowbar. Inside, wrapped in layers of old cloth, were more envelopes, some sealed, some torn open. They were filled with identification papers, driver's licenses, birth certificates, passports. Many were worn or stained, and nearly all of them bore names that didn't match the photographs she had found. She flipped through them, her fingers trembling. There were dozens, no, hundreds of identities, carefully organized and labeled with numbers written in her father's hand. She felt dizzy. These weren't keepsakes. They were records of people who had needed to disappear, or to become someone else. She remembered now, faintly, how strangers had sometimes come to the house when she was little, quiet, nervous men and women who never stayed long. Her father would send her outside to play while he met with them in the kitchen or out by the barn. She had never questioned it. She had assumed they were workers looking for odd jobs or people selling feed. But now she saw the truth. Her father had been helping them. She looked around the room again, seeing it with new eyes. The furniture, the papers, the careful organization. It wasn't chaos. It was a system. This space had been his hidden office, his refuge, his archive. Each document, each photo was a testimony to the people who had passed through his life, saved or sheltered under his roof. Her eyes fell on the bags again. For the first time, she felt certain that they were not filled with junk. They belonged to the same story. She rose and walked toward them, crouching beside the nearest one. The tape crackled under her fingers as she touched it. She hesitated. Her pulse thundered in her ears. What if what lay inside was something she wasn't ready to face? Her flashlight beam trembled across the floor, casting long, wavering shadows. Above her, the barn creaked softly as the wind shifted outside. Somewhere, a loose board tapped against the wall, steady and slow like a heartbeat. She pulled at the tape. It came away with a rough sound, the plastic splitting down the middle. Inside was a heap of fabric, old clothes folded carefully. She lifted one piece and recognized it instantly. A child's dress, yellow with white trim, small enough for a 6-year-old. Beneath it were other garments, men's jackets, women's skirts, all different sizes. The smell of cedar clung faintly to them, mixed with dust and time. At the very bottom, beneath a layer of folded cloth, something hard knocked against her hand. She reached in and pulled it out. It was a small wooden toy tractor, its paint chipped, one wheel missing. She turned it over, and there, scratched faintly into the underside, were the letters M.H., her initials. She sat back, stunned. The toy had been hers. She remembered it now, the Christmas when her father had carved it for her, his hands steady even though his eyes had already begun to show the fatigue of years. She had played with it in the barn until she was old enough to forget it, until the day he locked the doors and told her to stay away. The tears came slowly, not in sobs, but in quiet waves. She didn't know if they were for him, for herself, or for the years between them that had turned to silence. When she could breathe again, she wiped her face with her sleeve and kept searching. In the next bag, she found notebooks, her father's handwriting filling every line. Some were lists of names, others diaries of sorts, written in fragments. Notes about deliveries, dates, weather, and brief, coded phrases that only he could have understood. At the end of one, he had written, "If anything happens, trust the light. It always finds its way back through the cracks." Miria closed the book and pressed it to her chest. He had written these words for someone, for her, perhaps, though he could never have known she would be the one to find them. She sat there for a long while, surrounded by the evidence of his hidden life. The air was cold, but she didn't feel it anymore. It was as if she had stepped out of time, suspended between what she knew and what she was beginning to understand. Her father had built this place not out of secrecy, but out of necessity. He had been part of something that required silence, protection, sacrifice. And now, by leaving her the barn, he had passed that weight to her. When she finally climbed the stairs and closed the trap door behind her, the light from outside had shifted to gold again, spilling through the cracks like thin rivers. She stood in the middle of the barn and looked around. Everything felt different now. The space was no longer a ruin or a relic. It was alive again, filled with the hum of history. As she stepped out into the fading afternoon, she turned back once more. The barn stood still and solemn in the field, its shadow stretching long over the grass. She whispered softly, as if he might hear her through the wind, "I see you now, Daddy. I see what you did." The words disappeared into the air, but the silence that followed no longer felt empty. It felt like an answer. The next day began with the kind of stillness that makes every sound feel sharper, every movement deliberate. Miria woke before dawn, long before the first light touched the fields. The house was quiet, the air heavy with that faint chill of early morning when the world holds its breath. She sat on the edge of her bed, her father's old flannel shirt draped around her shoulders, staring at the pale stripe of light seeping under the curtain. She could not stop thinking about the notebook she had found, The words her father had written about the light finding its way through the cracks. Those words had settled deep inside her, like a seed taking root. There was more to uncover, and she knew it. When she stepped outside, the ground was wet with dew. The grass brushed against her jeans, darkening the fabric as she crossed the path toward the barn. The rising sun painted the horizon in soft orange, and a bird's cry echoed across the fields, lonely and distant. For the first time, the barn didn't look like a ruin. It looked like a place waiting to be understood. The air seemed to hum with quiet anticipation, as though the walls themselves were aware of what was coming. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. Dust motes swirled in the light like drifting sparks. The scent of hay and wood filled her lungs, grounding her. The trap door was right where she had left it, the edges now familiar under her touch. She knelt and lifted it, the hinges giving their long, tired groan. The darkness below yawned open like a memory she could finally enter without fear. This time, she carried more than a flashlight. She had brought a lantern from the shed, one of her father's old ones, polished until the brass gleamed faintly. When she lit it, the glow filled the stairwell with a golden warmth that cut through the cold air below. She descended slowly, one step at a time, until her boots touched the dirt floor. The smell of damp earth greeted her again, but it no longer felt oppressive. It felt familiar. She began by stacking the papers and photos she had examined the day before into neat piles, careful not to disturb their order. She wanted to make sense of everything, to see the pattern her father had seen. When she turned toward the shelves again, her light caught on something she hadn't noticed before. Behind one of the stacks of boxes, half hidden by a plank of wood, was another crate. Smaller than the others, sealed with rusted nails. On its lid, carved faintly into the surface, were 3 small circles intersecting at the center. Miria set the lantern down beside it and brushed away the dust. The symbol was familiar. She had seen it before, on the beam of the staircase, etched faintly into the wood as she descended that first day. Now she understood that it was not decoration, but a sign, a marker. Her father had always left marks when something mattered. She remembered him teaching her how to brand their livestock when she was young, explaining that every mark told a story, a claim, a promise. Perhaps this was his way of claiming this secret as his own. She pried open the crate with the crowbar, the wood splintering in her hands. Inside, beneath a layer of cloth, lay a collection of objects that seemed at once ordinary and profound. A stack of small leather-bound notebooks tied together with string. A silver pocket watch, its face cracked but still gleaming beneath the dirt. A folded piece of blue fabric that looked like part of a flag, and beneath it all, an envelope sealed with red wax bearing her father's initials. Her pulse quickened. She reached for the envelope but hesitated. Instead, she picked up one of the notebooks first. The pages were filled with her father's handwriting, neat and precise, the ink faded but still legible. Each entry began with a date, followed by short, clipped sentences. Some read like journal notes, others like coded instructions. April 17th, 1964. Delivered safely. 3 children, 1 woman. Stayed the night in the south stall. Left before dawn. June 2nd, 1965. Papers finished. Samuel helped cross the river. Too much attention lately. Must move faster. August 10th, 1965. New route set. Using the barn again. Safer than the house. The girl asked about the light in the rafters, told her it meant hope. Miria's throat tightened. He had been keeping records of people he helped. families, refugees of another kind, those displaced by laws and hatred. The barn had been more than a shelter for animals, it had been a sanctuary. She felt a strange, fierce pride rise inside her, tempered with sorrow. All those years she had thought he was just a quiet farmer living a simple life, but he had carried a purpose greater than anyone had imagined. She opened the next notebook. The entries grew more personal. The nights are longer now. The neighbors ask questions. Daniel and Tom don't understand. I can't let them see. Miria is too young, but she feels it. She sees what I can't hide. Maybe one day she'll know why. Her breath caught. He had written her name. He had thought of her even then. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. She closed the notebook gently, her fingers trembling, and picked up the envelope sealed with wax. The seal cracked easily beneath her thumb. Inside was a folded letter and something small wrapped in paper. She unfolded the letter carefully, afraid the paper might tear. If you are reading this, Miria, it means the time came when I could no longer tell you myself. I didn't leave you the barn because it was broken or worthless. I left it to you because it carries everything I could not say. The men who came here, the families who passed through, they all trusted me, but I was only one man. What they left behind, their names, their stories, needed someone who could keep them safe. I chose you because I know your heart. You see people the way I did, not for what they have, but for what they've lost. Everything hidden here belongs to you now, not because you earned it, but because you will understand it. Keep it alive, keep it honest. Remember that light always finds its way through the cracks. Her hand covered her mouth as she read. She could almost hear his voice, the slow rhythm of his speech, the warmth that had never left even when illness took the strength from him. The small package that had been inside the letter turned out to be a key, a simple brass key tied with a strip of red ribbon. It looked old, but not as old as the rest of the objects in the box. She turned it over in her fingers, feeling its weight. A key, but to what? She swept the light of the lantern across the room, searching the walls for anything that might match. That was when she saw it, the faint outline of metal embedded in the far wall behind the shelves. She pushed the boxes aside, her heart pounding. Dust rained down from the boards as she moved them. And there it was, a small safe, half hidden, its surface rusted but intact. The keyhole gleamed faintly in the lantern light. She knelt in front of it, her hands shaken, and inserted the key. For a second, she thought it wouldn't turn. Then it clicked softly, and the door creaked open. Inside was a stack of papers bound together, and on top of them another envelope addressed to her. Beneath that, a small collection of objects, a few coins, a ring, a photograph of her mother holding her as a baby. The sight of that photo undid her completely. She sank to her knees, tears falling freely now as the lantern light trembled beside her. When she could finally breathe again, she opened the second envelope. The letter inside was shorter than the first. Miria, if you found this, you have everything you need to know. I never told your brothers because they wouldn't have believed, and maybe I was afraid of what they'd do with it. The gold here isn't what matters. It's the record, the proof that people like us built this land and suffered for it, and that someone remembered them. These are their names, their stories. Don't let them vanish again. When you're ready, you'll know what to do. I trust you, my wild one. Your father. Beneath the letter, she found what he had mentioned, a small cloth pouch filled with gold coins and jewelry, but she barely glanced at it. Her hands went instead to the papers, documents bearing signatures, seals, and marks of ownership. Deeds, land deeds. Her father had gathered proof of property stolen from black farmers during the decades of forced sales and intimidation, evidence that had never reached the light. He had kept it safe, waiting for someone to bring it back into the world. Miria sat in silence for a long time, staring at the documents spread before her. She imagined the faces of the people from the photographs, their hands clasping her father's, their trust given freely to a man who had promised to protect their futures. He had carried that burden in secret, all while raising her, all while pretending to live an ordinary life. The barn had been both his shield and his confession. When she finally rose, her legs stiff and her eyes swollen, the lantern's light had dimmed. She turned down the wick, letting the flame shrink to a soft glow. The room felt smaller now, but warmer somehow. The cold was gone. She closed the safe gently, leaving it unlocked. There was no need for it to be hidden anymore. As she climbed the stairs, she thought about the words her father had written, about light finding its way through cracks. When she pushed open the barn door, the sun had climbed high, spilling gold across the fields. The air smelled of new rain, though none had fallen yet. She stood in the doorway, her hands covered in dust and her heart both heavy and unburdened. For years, she had believed her inheritance was nothing more than a joke, a punishment. But now she understood that it had been a test of faith, a way for her father to make sure that what he had protected would not be lost with him. She looked back at the barn one last time before walking toward the house, and for the first time, she felt it watching over her not as a burden, but as a legacy. Inside the kitchen, the clock on the wall ticked softly. She sat at the table and spread the documents out before her, smoothing the edges with care. Her father's voice seemed to whisper through the still air. Keep it alive. Keep it honest. Outside, the wind shifted through the fields, stirring the tall grass. The barn stood steady against the sky, its weathered boards glowing faintly in the sunlight. Somewhere inside its walls, the echoes of her father's quiet courage lingered, waiting for her next move. Miria closed her eyes and whispered into the silence, "I'll finish what you started." And as she said it, the faint sound of the rafters settling carried through the air, a sound that might have been the old building sighing, or perhaps, just for a moment, her father's voice answering back. The morning after her discovery, Miria woke to the sound of the wind rattling the shutters. It had rained during the night, soft at first, then heavier, drumming against the roof until it soaked through the earth. The air smelled of wet clay and honeysuckle, the scent of summer after a storm. She sat up slowly, her body heavy from sleeplessness. The papers she had brought from the barn lay spread across the table where she had left them, their edges curling slightly from the damp air. The sight of them filled her with both pride and dread. She knew what they meant now, what her father had risked, what he had preserved, but she also knew what would happen if she brought them into the light. She made coffee and drank it standing at the window. The world outside looked new-washed, gleaming under a shy sun that filtered through the breaking clouds. The barn, dark and silent at the far edge of the field, looked less like an old ruin now, and more like a monument. She thought of the safe, the gold, the letters, the deeds, proof that her father had been a part of something vast and invisible, a quiet act of rebellion that had lasted a lifetime. He had believed the past could be protected until someone brave enough came along to tell it. That someone was supposed to be her. By mid-morning, she had made her decision. She would go into town and speak to someone who could help her understand what these papers meant. Maybe a historian, a lawyer, anyone who could read the truth hidden in them. But first, she needed to tell her brothers. She couldn't keep this secret without at least trying to share it with them, even if she knew how they would react. They arrived later that day, their truck kicking up a trail of wet dust as it rolled down the dirt road. Tom was the first to step out. Tall, broad-shouldered, his suit jacket slung over one arm even though the air was thick with humidity. Daniel followed, wearing his habitual smirk, sunglasses pushed up on his forehead. They looked out of place here now, too polished, too sure of themselves. Miria met them on the porch, wiping her hands on a rag she had used for cleaning the lantern. "We need to talk," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. They exchanged glances, already suspicious. "About what?" Tom asked. "It's about the barn." Daniel laughed under his breath. "Don't tell me you're still messing around in that place. You've got to let it go, Miria. It's just a pile of wood and dust." She shook her head. "It's not just that. There's something under it. Dad left things. Papers, records, letters. You both need to see this." Their laughter faltered. Tom frowned, his voice turning sharp. "What kind of things?" She motioned for them to follow. Reluctantly, they did. The path to the barn was muddy, their shoes sinking with each step. When they reached the door, Miria pulled it open and led them inside. The air was cool, still scented with rain. She lifted the trapdoor and gestured to the staircase. "Down there." Tom leaned over the edge, his expression skeptical. "You've got to be kidding. What is this, some kind of basement?" "It's where Dad kept everything." Against their protests, she climbed down first, holding the lantern aloft. The golden light spilled across the familiar space, casting long shadows against the walls. Her brothers followed hesitantly, muttering about the damp and the smell. When they reached the bottom, Miria turned and faced them. "Look around," she said quietly. Tom's eyes swept the room. He noticed the filing cabinets, the boxes, the shelves stacked with papers. Daniel toed one of the black bags with the tip of his shoe. "What is all this junk?" "They're not junk," Miria said. "They're records, proof. Dad was helping people, black families who were losing their land, families forced off their homes. He kept their documents, their stories. This was his work." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then Daniel laughed, short and bitter. "You've lost it. He was a farmer, Miria. He couldn't even read half the stuff you're talking about. Why would he be mixed up in any of that?" "Because he cared," she said fiercely. "Because he saw what was happening and couldn't stand by. These deeds, these letters, they're proof that he was trying to protect them." Tom crossed his arms. "Even if that's true, and I'm not saying it is, what do you expect us to do with it? You think anybody cares about a bunch of old papers from 50 years ago? You're wasting your time." "I'm not wasting anything," Miria said. "I'm finishing what he started." They stared at her, their disbelief slowly hardening into something uglier. Tom shook his head. "You always were too sentimental. You gave up everything to take care of him, and now you can't let him go. Maybe this is just your way of holding on." His words hit her like a slap. She wanted to shout, to tell him how wrong he was, but instead she turned away and gathered the papers from the table, her hands trembling. "You don't have to believe me," she said quietly. "Just don't stand in my way." When she looked back, they were already climbing the stairs. "Do what you want," Daniel said over his shoulder, but don't come crying to us when you find out you've been cleaning up after his nonsense." The trap door slammed shut behind them. The sound echoed like thunder through the underground room. For a long time, Miria didn't move. She stared at the scattered light on the dirt floor, the dust floating through it like tiny sparks. Then she drew a slow, steady breath and began to gather the papers once more. She couldn't let their ignorance bury what her father had fought to preserve. That night, she sat at the kitchen table with a single lamp burning beside her. The rain had started again, tapping softly at the windows. She sorted the documents into stacks, letters, photographs, deeds, reading until her eyes blurred. The more she pieced together, the clearer the picture became. Her father had been part of a network, a small but powerful one, helping displaced black farmers reclaim stolen land or start anew in safer territories. It was dangerous work, often illegal in the eyes of the men who made the laws. He had hidden everything to protect not just himself, but the people who had trusted him. As she read, one name appeared over and over again: the Freeman Foundation. She searched through every letter until she found one that explained it. A group of volunteers who had worked quietly through the South during the 1950s and 60s, preserving records of black ownership, fighting fraudulent seizures. The letter was signed by a man named Samuel Freeman. Her father had mentioned him in his notebooks, calling him brother in purpose. She leaned back in her chair, exhaustion pulling at her bones. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, its cry long and mournful. She thought of her father and how alone he must have felt, keeping all this to himself. Maybe he had wanted to tell her before the end, but hadn't known how. Now the burden rested on her shoulders. The next morning, Miria drove into town with a folder of documents in the passenger seat. The windshield wipers beat a steady rhythm against the drizzle. She went first to the local historical society, a brick building that had once been the town library. Inside, the air smelled of paper and dust. The receptionist, a woman with kind eyes and silver hair, looked up as Miria approached. "I'd like to speak to someone about historical land deeds," Miria said. The woman led her to an office in the back where an archivist listened patiently as Miria explained what she had found. She laid out the deeds on the desk, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke about her father's hidden archive. The archivist studied the papers with growing astonishment. "These are extraordinary," he said finally. "You realize what this means? Some of these properties were thought to have no surviving proof of ownership. If these are authentic, they could help families reclaim their rights even generations later." Miria nodded. "That's what I was hoping. My father wanted them to be seen." They agreed to authenticate the papers, to cross-check the names and dates. As she left the building, she felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. The truth was finally beginning to move beyond the walls of the barn, but not everyone shared her hope. When her brothers heard that she had taken the documents into town, Tom called her that evening, his voice sharp with anger. "You had no right," he said. "Those papers were part of Dad's estate. You can't just hand them over to strangers." "They belong to the people they were stolen from," Miria replied. "Dad was trying to do the right thing." "You're making us look like fools," he snapped. "Do you have any idea what people are saying? That our father was involved in something shady, that he was hiding illegal documents? You're dragging his name through the mud." "I'm restoring it," she said softly, but the line had already gone dead. After that call, silence settled between them. She knew they would not forgive her easily, but she no longer cared. The truth mattered more than their pride. Weeks passed. The archivist confirmed the authenticity of the records, and soon local papers began writing about the hidden archive beneath the Harper barn. Reporters came, photographers, even historians from the state university. They wanted to see the place where one man had preserved decades of forgotten history. Miria allowed them in, but made them promise to treat it with respect. She told them her father's story, not as a myth, but as a truth that had waited too long in the dark. At first, the townspeople gossiped, half proud, half suspicious. Then, descendants of the families named in the documents began to appear. People who brought their grandparents' photographs, who spoke in hushed tones about land their families had lost generations ago. Miria listened to them all, writing down their stories, connecting the names to the faces in her father's photographs. Each time someone thanked her, she thought of him sitting alone in that underground room, the lamplight flickering across his face as he wrote in his notebooks. He must have known this day might come when the truth would rise through the cracks he left behind. But even as recognition grew, so did resistance. Developers began circling, angry that the rediscovered deeds threatened new projects. Some locals accused her of fabricating evidence, of inventing stories for attention. The sheriff stopped by one evening, polite but firm, to ask a few questions. "People are saying you're stirring up trouble," he said, removing his hat as he stood on her porch. "I'm not stirring anything," Miria answered. "I'm just telling the truth." "Well, truth can be a dangerous thing around here," he replied. After he left, she stood in the fading light, her heart heavy but steady. The words didn't scare her. She understood now what her father must have felt, the fear, the loneliness, but also the certainty that what he was doing mattered. One evening, as she walked back from the barn, the sky ablaze with sunset, she stopped halfway across the field. The air shimmered with the last heat of the day, and the scent of grass rose around her. She looked back at the house, then at the barn, and felt something settle inside her. She had made her choice. The work would continue, no matter who stood against it. When she reached the barn door, she touched the rough wood and whispered, "It's safe now, Daddy. They know." The wind stirred softly through the rafters, lifting the dust into golden ribbons that danced in the dying light. For the first time, she didn't feel alone. She understood then that her father's greatest act hadn't been hiding the truth, but trusting her to find it. And she had. The burden that had once felt unbearable had turned into something else entirely. Purpose. She would protect it, no matter the cost. That night, as darkness fell over the fields, the barn stood silent and strong, its roof gleaming faintly beneath the rising moon. Inside, the lantern still burned, casting its soft circle of light across the dirt floor. It flickered gently, steady as a heartbeat, as if the spirit of the man who built it was still there, watching, proud of the daughter who had finally carried his secret into the open air. The summer sun had grown heavy over the valley, ripening the air into gold. Weeks had passed since Miria had first stepped into the secret beneath the barn, and now the world around her seemed to move with a different rhythm, slower, gentler, yet somehow more alive. The storm of voices that had once surrounded her, the rumors, the reporters, the suspicion, had begun to fade into the steady hum of acceptance. People no longer whispered when she passed through town. They nodded, some respectfully, some with quiet awe. The woman who had been mocked for inheriting a pile of dust and mice had become the keeper of something far greater than a building. She had become the keeper of memory. The barn itself had changed, though its bones were still the same. The roof had been repaired, the old red boards sanded and oiled until they shone deep like mahogany under the sun. The windows, long broken, now glowed with panes of glass that caught the light like calm water. Inside, the dirt floor had been replaced with wooden planks reclaimed from a dismantled church nearby, polished until they reflected the soft amber glow of the lanterns she hung from the beams. But she had kept much of it as it was. The rough scent of hay, the worn grooves of tools on the walls, the echoes of her father's footsteps. It was important that the spirit of the place remained. It was no longer just a barn. It had become a living archive. On the walls hung photographs she had restored, faces of men, women, and children who had once been only ghosts in fading paper. Beneath each photo, a small brass plate bore a name, and the story her father's documents had helped her uncover. Families had come from all over the state, bringing their own histories, their letters, their heirlooms. Together, they had filled the shelves that lined the room, jars of soil from lands once lost, tools that had belonged to great-grandfathers, diaries written in looping cursive that spoke of labor and hope. The stories wove together like threads, connecting generations across time. Miria often stood in the doorway at dusk, watching the light stretch across the floor in long, honey-colored lines. The barn breathed around her, alive with memory, filled with voices that spoke without sound. Sometimes, when the wind moved through the rafters, she could almost hear her father's whistle, that steady tune he used to hum while working. She had kept his chair near the back wall, beside the photograph of him as a young man, standing beside Samuel Freeman. The photo had been cleaned and framed, the two men captured in the solemn certainty of their cause. It had taken months of persistence, endless nights of sorting and cataloging, but her father's name was now known far beyond the county lines. Articles had been written, documentaries planned. The Freeman Foundation, long thought dissolved, had been revived by descendants of those it had once helped. They had contacted Miria, offering funding to preserve the barn as a permanent museum and community center. She had agreed, but on one condition: the place would remain free and open to everyone. No gates, no tickets. It belongs to them, she had told the organizers. It always did. The dedication ceremony took place on an early autumn afternoon. The air was crisp, the sky an endless blue that made the barn's red walls glow brighter. People came from miles around: families, teachers, church choirs, journalists, old farmers who had known her father in silence. They filled the field behind the barn with folding chairs and long tables covered in white cloths. Children ran through the grass, their laughter rising like music. When it was time for the speeches, Miria stood at the small podium they had built from reclaimed wood. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the microphone, the hum of feedback fading into the quiet rustle of the crowd. She looked out over the faces turned toward her, some familiar, some not, but all watching with the same quiet expectation. The sun was setting behind them, gilding everything it touched. She took a breath. "My father, Harold Harper, never called himself a hero," she began. "He never asked for praise, never sought attention. To most of you, he was just a farmer, a quiet man who minded his land and kept to himself. But now we know he was something more. He saw injustice and decided that silence wasn't an option. He believed that even one person, working in the shadows, could make a difference. What he built here wasn't just a barn. It was a refuge, a promise kept to those who had nowhere else to go." Her voice caught for a moment, but she didn't stop. "When I first came back here after his passing, I thought I'd been forgotten, cast aside. This barn felt like punishment. But I was wrong. It was his way of showing me who he truly was and of trusting me to carry it forward. He once wrote that light always finds its way through the cracks. I think he was right. We are that light now, all of us standing here, remembering, rebuilding, refusing to let the truth be buried. Applause rippled through the crowd, soft at first, then rising like the wind through the trees. Miria stepped back, tears glinting in her eyes. Behind her, the brass plaque gleamed in the last rays of daylight. It read, "The Harper Archive of Remembrance, in honor of those who remembered others." After the ceremony, as twilight deepened, Miria wandered away from the gathering. The sounds of conversation and laughter faded into a low hum behind her. She walked toward the back of the barn, where the old trap door remained sealed but still visible, preserved beneath a sheet of clear glass set into the floor. She knelt beside it and rested her hand against the cool surface. The light from the lanterns above flickered faintly on the metal ring, and for a moment she could almost imagine the faint echo of his voice. "Thank you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if the words were meant for him or for herself. The air stirred, warm and gentle, and she smiled. In the following months, the barn became a place of pilgrimage. School children came on field trips, tracing their fingers along the photographs. Elderly men sat in her father's chair, telling stories that no one had heard in decades. Historians came from the city, asking permission to study the documents, to record oral histories. Every visitor added something: a new photograph, a letter, a memory. The archive grew until it became not just a collection of the past, but a living testament to survival and faith. Miria stayed busy, but the work never felt like a burden. Each morning she swept the porch, opened the windows to let in the sunlight, and lit a candle by the photograph of her parents. At night, when the world was still, she sat by the doorway and listened to the creak of the wood, the sound of the wind moving through the cracks. The loneliness she had once carried like a stone had softened into peace. One afternoon in late November, her brothers returned. She saw their truck pull up along the road, the same one that had brought them years ago on the day of the will. Tom stepped out first, his hair more gray than she remembered, his eyes uncertain. Daniel followed, quieter than she had ever seen him. They stood together at the edge of the field, watching her approach. "We saw the news," Tom said, his voice low. "The museum, it's beautiful," Miria nodded. "It's his work, not mine." "It's yours now," Daniel said. "You made it real." For a long moment, none of them spoke. The air between them was thick with all the things they had never said, the arguments, the silences, the years of distance. Then Tom reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "We found this in Dad's old desk," he said. "Figured it was meant for you." She took it carefully. Inside was a photograph of the three of them as children, standing in front of the barn on a summer day. Their father knelt behind them, his arms draped across their shoulders, his smile wide and open. On the back, written in his familiar handwriting, were the words, "One day you'll understand why I built this place." Miria looked up at her brothers, her throat tightening. "I think I do," she said softly. They stayed for a while, walking through the barn in silence, touching the walls, reading the names. When they left, there was no need for forgiveness. It was already there, unspoken and complete. That evening, after the last visitor had gone and the lanterns burned low, Miria stepped outside. The sky was deep blue, scattered with stars. The air was cool, the kind that hinted at winter. She stood in the middle of the field, the barn behind her glowing softly with warm light, and listened to the quiet. The same land that had once held her grief now held her peace. She thought of her father again, of his quiet laughter, his steady hands, his faith that even the smallest act of courage mattered. He had been gone for years, but in some way he had never truly left. His voice still echoed in the wind, his lessons written in every beam and board she had restored. "I found it, Daddy," she whispered, the words drifting into the night. "I found what you left me." The wind moved through the grass, gentle and steady, carrying with it the faintest hint of a whistle, the same tune he had hummed when she was little. It rose and fell like breath, and then it was gone, swallowed by the stars. Miria turned back toward the barn, her heart light and full. The open door glowed with a warm, golden light that spilled across the ground like a path. She walked toward it, her steps slow and sure, feeling the earth firm beneath her feet. Inside, the air was still, the smell of wood and oil and time mingling in the soft glow of the lanterns. She paused by the photograph of her father and smiled. "We did it," she said quietly. "They remember now." Outside, the wind rose once more, brushing gently against the walls, and the barn answered with a low creak, a sound that felt like gratitude. Miria stood in that silence for a long time, until the light around her softened and the night settled deep over the valley. Then she blew out the lanterns one by one, each flame dimming into darkness, until only the memory of their glow remained. The barn slept, but the story it held no longer did. It lived on, in the fields, in the photographs, in every voice that whispered its name. And as Miria stepped out into the cool night air, she knew her father had been right all along. Light always finds its way through the cracks. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. There are more incredible stories coming that you won't want to miss. Watch the next video right here and share this one with your friends.